My name is Victoria Rodriguez. I'm a professor here at the LBJ School and a friend and colleague and great admirer of Maggie Rivas Rodriguez for many, many years. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I have Maggie and I came to UT more or less at the same time, and so it has been a great pleasure to follow Maggie's wonderful work on Latinos. And so I will be moderating the session. It's a pleasure for me to do so. I work on women in politics. I teach courses on women in politics. My specialty is women in Latin America. I'm doing this wonderful research project right now on the women presidents of Latin America. So it's great to be here. What I'm going to do is, now that I have briefly introduced myself, is to ask each one of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And then I'll give each one of them a strict 20 minutes for their presentation, so we could leave enough time for questions and for discussion. So I'll start with my colleague, Emilio Zamora.
Emilio Zamora, History Department. I'm a professor specializing in Mexican American history, Texas history, and oral history. My more recent book is a translation and editing job on a World War I diary by a Mexican American from South Texas, Jose de la Luz Sainz.
Tiffany Gonzalez.
Hi, y'all. I'm Tiffany Gonzalez. I'm a doctoral student at Texas A&M University in the field of history. My dissertation project will focus on Latinas and Chicanas in electoral politics in the 70s and 80s.
Yes.
And some of my current research will be published in an upcoming book entitled Mexicano Resilience, Essays in Honor of Arnaldo de Leon. And yeah, so my paper today is entitled Pathways to Political Office, Chicana Political Engagement in Central West Texas.
That's wonderful that you're doing this work, Tiffany. Santiago Piñon.
My name is Santiago Piñon. I am a professor of religion at Texas Christian University. I've only been there 4 years. Not recent. I graduated from with a PhD at the University of Chicago in 2012. My research interest is in the intersection of law and religion. My only claim to fame are my children. My wife and I have been married for 15 years, I think. We tried really hard to have kids, and we tried hard to have kids, couldn't get pregnant. We finally got pregnant, went to the doctor, and the doctor says, "Congratulations, you're pregnant." We're like, "Yeah, all right." We threw a party and all that. I drank, she did not. A lot. Second visit to the doctor says, "Hey, surprise, you're having twins." I'm like, "Oh, yay, right? There's two of us, two of them, we could do this." Go back to third visit, the doctor says, "Congratulations, one split." I'm like, "One split? What do you mean by that? That one split?" I said, "Did it go down the toilet? Did it leave? Did it say, what happened?" And he goes, "No, you're having triplets."
Oh,
yeah.
Stop going to the doctor.
Because I don't want, this is a public event, I don't want to say it in crude language, so I'll say it in French. I said really loud, "La merde!" And my wife hit me, of course, right? I was like, "Oh no, yay!" So that is my claim to fame, which is I have powerful Mexican sperm that can split eggs.
Okay, Santiago, so that was your
Claim.
Well, your claim to fame in your introduction. I think we're going to leave your paper for last. It's going to be of that variety. So we'll start with Emilio. I'll stand up when you have about 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Okay, and then I'll stand up again when you're done.
All right.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Emilio.
Well, I have a little introduction that I didn't plan to do, but arriving here and witnessing so many people that are so much a part of our history, recent and distant history, inspired me a bit. I was just talking to Mr. Avena, the former regional director of the Civil Rights Commission, and of course there's other people, Silvio Martinez and others who have been important members of our community and our history, and I just can't help but feel honored and inspired. I always feel honored when I speak about our people, but especially now. And I want to share with you part of the conversation I had with Mr. Avena. We have been a convictional community, and when we ask ourselves what it is that, as I've heard people ask, you know, what have we accomplished? And I think we've done a number of things aside from the material goals that we sought and were able to meet. I think we've maintained a conviction in our community and strengthened it, and that goes a long damn way. I think we also have been representing majority views in our community. We don't tell ourselves that enough. We have been representing majority views in our community, which explains to a great extent our sense of conviction and righteousness in our movement and in our work as researchers. My paper is in two parts. I'm going to deal with only one part. It is based on a class that I organized some years ago in a graduate course on Mexican American history. I've decided, usually you give students an opportunity to use their own history, the graduate course experience, to advance their own projects, theses or dissertations. This time I just used my authority and imposed this project on them. I thought it was necessary that we do something on Raza Unida women. I have great admiration for the Raza Unida women. We have some here among us, primarily Maria Elena Martinez, who was our state chair for the Raza Unida Party in 1974. By the way, I was the last Travis County chair for the Raza Unida in 78. I think the Raza Unida women made important contributions. The Raza Unida Party as a whole, I think, made use of opportunities that were available in the 1970s, among which, of course, was the Voting Rights Act and its effect that it's had in our community. We made use of that opportunity. There were people, you know, now have an increasing number of people now had the opportunity to participate in the electoral process, and they were doing it. And I think we made use of that. Let me read the introduction, and I'm going to read the conclusion as well. I'm not going to talk about the course, about how we organized it. I'm proposing that it be a model for other people who may want to teach courses that involves community. But let me start with Marta Cotera, another very important person in our history, who's not here in Mexico City doing some fine political work. Marta Cotera, the author of the first book-length study on the history of Mexican American women and a major figure in the Mexican civil rights and women's movements of Texas, declared that women were the backbone in La Raza Unida Party. The political party led the third party challenge in Texas against the Democratic and Republican parties in 72, 74, and 78. And of course, we have Jose Angel Gutierrez in the back, who was also a very prominent figure in that history. Her claim, being the backbone, placed women in the center of a historical social movement. The RUP may have only elected candidates to public office in its rural strongholds of South Texas, but the mostly young adherents contributed much to history. RUP activists helped energize the Mexican origin electorate with a potent nationalist critique of social inequality and political underrepresentation. It compelled the Democratic Party leadership to take greater notice of Mexicans, provided valuable training ground for a good number of the future political leaders, and contributed to the eventual emergence of the two-party system in Texas. Cotera reminds us that women also shared in this experience and that they were especially important in using the party as a platform for the womanist and feminist ideals that she promotes in her analysis of history and her continuing social activist involvement. Although Cotera offered her provocative views on previous public occasions, her more recent pronouncements occurred during a public forum organized by graduate students enrolled in my seminar. She did it in a reunion-like setting alongside 8 other like-minded party women activists during interviews and testimonials planned and conducted by the graduate students in my class. The unprecedented experience provided Cotera, as well as other narrators, the unique opportunity to share their individual collective historical memories and their analysis of past experience. Recalling and analyzing the past, in other words, became a mutually reinforcing experience for the participants, especially since they also took part in the planning and implementation of the project. Although one could argue that all historical memory and its interpretation is socially mediated to one degree or another, or that individual experiences ultimately produce singular views, the unambiguous cooperation among the graduate students and RUP women must be considered when analyzing the views of the narrators like Cotera. I was very fortunate, all my students were women, by the way. What I'm suggesting here is that they built this really special relationships with the women that visited. And that's the nature of oral history, I think. It's very special. You're able to create a document, a historical record with alongside the narrator. In other words, you're co-authoring a record. Let me just skip on to the conclusion because we don't have much time. I can make the paper available to you all if you give me your email afterwards. Cotera's characterization of Mexican women as a backbone in history frames at least 4 general observations that the narrators made during the interviews and the testimonial events. One of the recurring comments was that women performed an inordinate amount of mundane tasks such as cooking, secretarial work, and child care planning activities during the REP years. Cotera and Martinez acknowledged that they were necessary activities. These were necessary activities and that women should be credited with, quote, doing what had to be done for the sake of the movement and the party. The women, in other words, were said to be more responsible, even some acquiesced to the even as some acquiesced to the discrimination and demeaning behaviors that undergirded the practices. This suggested an essentialist view, that is to say that women by nature are more caring, more concerned, so forth. But it's a strategic essentialist view that I could elaborate during the question and answer period. This suggested an essentialist view that women were more inclined to be egalitarian and less hierarchical than men, and that women, as a consequence, were more focused on coalition building and less concerned with personal or political gain. Luz Bazan, reminded us that women in the RUP also challenged the discrimination with refusals to cooperate and even used it to elaborate critiques that called for the application of democratic principles everywhere lest the party be seen as vacuous and hypocritical. During her testimonial, Bazan also recounted an event at Crystal City to underscore the pervasive nature of gender discrimination and the willingness of the women to challenge the views as participants of lesser importance as they were seen. The men, including, in some cases, not entirely, there was also great respect granted to women among some of the men. The men, including Bazan's husband, Jose Angel Gutierrez, had arranged for a visit by Professor Ralph Guzman from California. She used the story to illustrate what she meant, and had assumed that, as they were accustomed to do under these circumstances, that the women would make the necessary food preparations. This was said to be the standard practice in Ciudadanos Unidos, the community organization that gave rise to the party at Crystal City. The women had other thoughts on that day. When the professor arrived and the organization convened at the local hall to hear him speak, some men noticed that all the women were present, an obvious sign that the food would not be ready. The women announced that the food had not been prepared because they had decided that the event was so important that everyone had to attend. They also took the opportunity to point out that the women had equal rights and that the men had to start acknowledging that basic fact. It helped that the professor agreed with the women. Bazan did not explain if the incident made an appreciable difference, and no one in the audience asked her. She was obviously more interested in saying that women had resisted rather than possibly admitting that gender inequality remained relatively undisturbed in the party. Cotera also pointed out that women demonstrated backbone by continuously and enthusiastically supporting the party as organizers and candidates for political office, suggesting yet another central role in the RUP. Cotera, as well as Chapa, Ivy Chapa, Jimenez, ¿cómo se llama? Jimenez. Maria Jimenez, Alma Canales, and of course Maria Elena Martinez, were unambiguous on this point as they pointed to event after event that illustrated their contention. Canales' campaign for Secretary of State in '72 was mentioned several times during the testimonials. Canales, without the necessary funds, with great sacrifice and often in face of danger to her life, waged an almost solitary campaign that became a symbol of commitment and determination in the party. Martinez built a well-known reputation as a thoroughly committed and hardworking state chair between '74 and '78. One of the things I remember, one of the reasons I think you won is because everybody agreed you could be trusted. You were an honest person. You were how you presented yourself. That's how you presented yourself. Jimenez, on the other hand, gave her audience a taste of the sharp wit and intellectual prowess associated with the campaign for state representative in '72. She explained of how her authoritarian father had taught her to speak boldly for social justice. Her mother had shown her how to speak to power, a skill that she now used when she advocated for immigrant rights. Cotera and Chapa, the principal leaders of Mujeres por la Raza, were actually there were others, but there were two of the principal leaders, were especially adamant in arguing a third point, that women demonstrated a special commitment to the party when they negotiated a strategic link of cooperation with the Texas Women's Political Caucus between '72 and '78. And this was not an easy matter because the white women's political caucus, for the most part white, wasn't very welcoming. So they had to, they couldn't just walk in and become part of that group and build unity between that group and the rest of the party. It was very difficult. It was very contentious. Mujeres por la Raza, according to Cotera and Chapa, used their natural association with the women's political group in Texas to advance the cause of the party. This involved much time and effort to bore into the Texas Women's Political Caucus and to promote a broader Mexican feminist project that included women and their communities. That was the argument that from my reading of things, Mexican women were making, that they didn't just come alone as women, they came along with their communities, and they had to be accepted as such. They basically socialized the feminist movement in the state of Texas to a great extent. The men in RUP never fully understood or appreciated the effort and even opposed it, according to the women. They nevertheless once again remained solidly behind the party and introduced new women into the party with their feminist appeal and their tenuous working relationship with the Texas Women's Political Caucus. The fourth major backbone observation also concerned the Texas Women's Political Caucus. This time the contribution was ideological. Cotera and Chapa claimed that Mujeres por la Raza advanced the cause by elaborating nationalist and feminist ideas as intermediaries between the party and organized Anglo-feminists. In their view, they received little credit in either camp for broadening their appeal and constructing the useful working relationship between the groups. Mexican women, according to Cotera and Chapa, nevertheless demonstrated that their middle position allowed them to join in two separate discourses and to conceive a critique that offered Mexican nationalists and Anglo-feminists a way to evolve ideologically and organizationally. Although they only created temporary openings for themselves within both organizations, they used their special intermediary status as negotiating political capital in the internal workings of the party and the caucus. The UP women did not always agree in their accounts. Elvia Rios, who was in the Valley, and Mendoza Waterhouse. I have her first name elsewhere. Angelita Mendoza Waterhouse, for instance, at times disagreed with the rest of the women on the degree of discrimination that women faced and the influence of women in the party. Also, some of them, especially Jimenez and Martinez, prefer to describe their participation in RUP history with little reference to gender or feminist ideas. Con todo respeto, Maria Elena. While others, namely Cotera and Chapa, emphasized the women's experience and often spoke from an explicitly feminist perspective. It's not to say that we're feminists, it's a matter of emphasis. Disagreements and differences in emphasis reminds us that the 9 narrators had different social backgrounds, participated in various capacities in the party, and followed different social pathways and political trajectories since 1978. Brenda Sendejo has done a great study basically dealing with this and many of the things, what happened to these women after 78. Although all the narrators shared working class origins, some were poorer than others. Some were born and raised in Mexico, while others came from rural communities in Texas, and still others originated in towns and cities from throughout the state. That diversity explains the differences, but it also, I think, accents the significance of the unity despite the differences. Most of them experienced discrimination and were students when they joined the party. However, they served the party in different capacities and thus spoke from different vantage points. They 3 served in elected positions and 2 headed electoral campaigns. The rest of them mostly belonged to the rank and file. Since the demise of the RP, the narrators pursued various political interests. Jimenez, for instance, became a national spokesperson for immigrant rights and professes a decidedly progressive stance on working class rights. Rios became a staunch Democrat. Martinez prefers to define herself as a naturalist, and curandera with a feminist predisposition. Chapa found her niche in the middle class classroom, still advocating social justice and women's rights. Mendoza Waterhouse served as a family court judge for years and recently ran for the judgeship under the Republican Party, when, according to her, the Democratic leadership in Travis County failed to support her. The Toro and Canales have raised families and participated in Democratic Party politics. The important differences notwithstanding, the women demonstrated an amazing degree of unanimity on a number of issues. They agreed that women had been important in the history of the party, and most of them embraced the idea that the women's experience of discrimination and political involvement is critical for understanding the RUP and Mexican American history. The RUP women also suggested that men exploited women's work and reproduced unequal relations in the party. Moreover, when they described their political work, they often drew on a strategic, essentialist symbol of the women as a central unifying element in the Mexican-American family. They did this to both generate and solidify commitment to an ongoing women's cause, and also to communicate current womanist, if not feminist, identities. In the process of speaking to us, they claimed a distinct ownership over the history of the party and Mexican Americans. They were clearly seeking to provide us with verifiable accounts of past events, of inscribing and reinscribing women into political history. They were also motivated by the idea that they were joining us to create records that correct past erasures and misrepresentations. In other words, they're participating in the interpretation of this history, okay, which is very significant. We don't always acknowledge that when we interview people, that they're offering us interpretations, and that their own interpretations have become a co-authorship of sorts on the works that we produce. And that's what basically is happening with this paper I'm reading to you now. Given their treatment by historians and their male contemporaries, they were naturally inclined to set the record straight. That was their predisposition, to avoid the very practices that had marginalized them. This does not mean that they were not also reconstructing memory with hindsight. They were reconstructing memory. That's what I mean when I say that they were strategically essentialists. Because someone like Marta Cotera, for example, when she says we were the backbone, she was basically arguing that as the backbone of the movement then, they had a special responsibility to promote a lead in the current movement. So I've got 2 minutes and a part of a paragraph to read. I'm finished. This does not mean that they were not also reconstructing memory with hindsight, interpreting the past on the basis of ongoing political projects and current feelings and ideas, nor does it mean that our own subjectivities as researchers did not also shape the content direction of the narratives. The director of the project was a former Trust Media member, for example. These and many more methodological and theoretical issues raised by our research project must await a more detailed analysis of our findings and the memories that recall and interpret them. For now, it is enough to say that the project was a valuable experience for the students and for me. Thank you.
It was excellent, Emilio. Thank you. We'll now turn over to Tiffany Gonzalez. The title of her talk today is Pathways to Political Office, Chicana Mexican-American Political Engagement in West Central Texas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez. So I want to thank everyone in attendance, as well as Dr. Rivas Rodriguez and Dr. Leal for setting up this conference. It's been a privilege attending this event and listening to several wonderful scholars speak about Latino political engagement and empowerment. You know, as us scholars, our work could not come into fruition without the past and present activists pushing for Latino and Latino rights in America. So my paper is entitled Pathways to Political Office, Chicana Political Engagement in West Central Texas. It's a small piece of two larger projects of mine. I build from numerous scholars who have written on Women La Raza Unida Party, like Dr. Zamora. Dr. Espinosa's soon-to-be published monograph on Women of La Raza Unida Party. Dr. Linda Quintanilla's work on Women of La Raza Unida Party focusing on Houston and Austin, and her soon-to-be published biography on Maria Jimenez from Houston. So today's paper will focus on one woman, Madea Cardenas, a former Raza Unida Party member who spearheaded the creation of single-member districts in San Angelo, Texas. I've looked at many women from the West Texas region, but I chose to highlight Cardenas for this paper. I take a biographical approach to shed light on Cardenas's social and political environment that inspired her to be an active leader in the community. My aim is to bring a history of a Chicana in electoral politics and to show that Chicanas are leaders who can create change. So let me begin with a little biography of her. Madea Cardenas was born in Tivoli, Texas, a rural farming town located in South Texas on January 20th, 1935. Tivoli resides in Refugio County, which was a major cotton-producing region in the early 20th century. And just as many other South Texas towns, migrant wage laborers formed the backbone of the cotton production. Cardenas grew up watching her parents labor in the fields, along with her 8 siblings, and later raised 6 children of her own in San Angelo. Her desire to see justice and equality for her family empowered her to become a leader in Chicano and Chicano rights. Because of her lived experiences, she fought to improve the living and working conditions for Mexican Americans. Cardenas utilized the space between family, women's organization, and city politics to embark in political engagement and community activism. Her political and community activism was grounded in the intersections of race, class, and gender equality, which later drew her to politics and commitment to social justice. So by the mid-1960s developed a pivotal time for Cardenas' emergence in discussing community and national politics. And a lot of this is perhaps because of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society speech that was kind of pushing for, which announced the enactment of domestic programs to help the poor and combat racial injustice in society. And it garnered a lot of attention for Chicanos and Chicanos. Many people began to reevaluate their contribution to their society and community. As someone who grew up in a family of migrant farm workers, Cardenas understood the issues of the poor. Cardenas rooted her activism in helping the Chicano and Chicano community, and she focused on protecting and serving those whom she really cared for in life. So she expressed a community, collective class, and racial hardship in San Angelo. Although in the beginning she didn't finish high school, but because of her experiences with school engendered her passion for education, which she viewed as a way to battle injustice in society. As such, she ensured her children received the education that they deserved. Through education, she believed the world could be a better place. During this time in San Angelo, schools were segregated, and thus she used her local newspaper as a political tool to voice her opinion to the community. She frequently wrote to the newspaper to discuss the discriminatory nature of busing Mexican-American students to white schools, but not bringing white students to the barrio. Another time she wrote to the newspaper and said, "White children have been taught that Chicanos are dirty and have no ambition, and that black people don't marry." She knew that segregating children by race caused more harm than good. Compounding the issues of educational quality, children from different races were not able to learn about different cultures due to the rigors of segregation. Cardenas continued to utilize the local newspaper to discuss other issues like labor. She wrote to the editor of the newspaper in response to an article posted about the Valley workers who voted to unionize. In a printed article, she replied to the people who criticized the Valley workers, and she used witty replies and insisted if these owners would just think and say, these are not machines, they are people, no union would be needed. She reminded the public that farm workers deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. So my purpose of highlighting Cardenas' use of newspapers is to show that as a Chicana, she was not afraid to voice her opinion to the whole community. At times, Anglo residents would reply back with negative remarks, but that didn't stop her. She was quite active in Democratic politics in San Angelo, but by the early 1970s, she aligned herself with Texas' third party, La Raza Unida Party. Cardenas began attending many Raza Unida events across Texas. She traveled to San Antonio, where Raza Unida Party members discussed if they should expand the party statewide, which they did. At the same event, Cardenas ran for state committee woman, but lost to Alma Canales. Despite her loss, her ambition for political leadership did not wither away. In 1972, she traveled to El Paso for La Raza Unida's National Convention, where she sat as Tom Green County's voting delegate. She also campaigned for Ramsey Muñiz in San Angelo. For many people in the audience who are familiar with the more western region of Texas, particularly in the 1970s, the area could be seen as very unwelcoming for Chicanas and Chicanos in electoral politics. So 2 weeks after that national meeting, Cardenas, along with two others, met to voice their opinions on how their political parties could seek the votes of their Mexican-American Chicano community. Cardenas, who represented La Raza Unida Party, Madea Dominguez of the Democratic Party, and Isaac Oliveras, an avid supporter of the Republican Party, discussed several strategies and ideas that each of their parties took to appeal to the community. So during the meeting, Cardenas reminded those in attendance that day what the party fought for, and I quote, "Our people are together, they are united, and all have the same problems and dreams." At the National Convention, for instance, even without talking to each other, almost all state delegations came out with the same resolutions to be passed. They included proposals on drugs, law enforcement, unemployment, and housing, unquote. Aiming to spread the word about Chicano awareness within San Angelo, Cardenas continued to use local newspapers and media outlet in hopes of reaching an audience. Additionally, La Raza Unida Party members placed many leaflets around San Angelo as a way to introduce the community to people and the ideology of the movement. The party sought to offer the community uncompromised participation in the political process. Furthermore, Cardenas believed wholeheartedly that La Raza Unida Party brought positive changes. So Cardenas and other La Raza Unida activists faced criticism from the Anglo community. When an Anglo community organizer denounced the movement and asked, "Why La Raza Unida Party?" Cardenas simply replied back in the newspaper and said, "People like him are why La Raza Unida Party." Demonstrating the solidarity among Chicanas and Chicanos of La Raza Unida Party, her response to him outlines why Chicanos and Chicanas banded together against people who discriminated against them and did not believe in their political empowerment. So Cardenas' political activism did not emerge in a vacuum. Many factors such as family, community, and culture, education, race, and class politics, as well as women's empowerment, played into the development of her Chicana identity. These factors, tempered through the participation of the party, sharpened Cardenas' political conscientiousness and encouraged her to enter local city politics. After voting much time to La Raza Unida, she saw herself she wanted to continue to challenge the political structure in San Angelo. So by 1975, she slowly moved away from La Raza Unida Party and returned to local, focusing more on local politics in San Angelo. And so at that time, that same year, in 1975, it's where she met Frank Simpson, a civics teacher who lived and taught in the Lakeview area neighborhood, which was, in his neighborhood, was a predominantly Anglo lower socioeconomic neighborhood at that time. And so many of the same issues that he was facing, because it was a working class Anglo neighborhood compared to the Rio Vista neighborhood that Cardenas was from, kind of had the same issues, that the politicians weren't taking care of them, they weren't hearing their needs. So Frank Simpson had always been a Democrat, and so his meeting with Cardenas enabled him to get more involved in San Angelo city politics. And I use a quote that Mr. Simpson said about Cardenas when I interviewed him. So I'll quote, "One day at the end of school, I was driving back from school and saw a woman on the side of the street with a man. They were driving yard stake signs on the ground, and they said, "Support single-member districts." So I stopped and said to the women, "How can I help get this done?" "Well, come on." This is Maria. "Well, come on, and I will show you." And this was Maria with her husband, Abel. And that point forward, he says, she and I was the person without the context, like Maldef. So Simpson and Cardenas became personal friend and political ally throughout this process with the creation of single-member districts. And it became kind of their primary political goal in San Angelo. So political institutions like Maldef provided the legal support and political clout Cardenas needed in her quest to restructure voting districts. Also, a strong category of local personalities supported Cardenas' political movement, including outspoken activists who also resided in San Angelo, like Vicky Reddy and Juanita Canfield, as well as Maldef attorney George Corbell from San Antonio. So implementing single-member districts in San Angelo encouraged gender, race, and class equality in the city politics. The adoption of district voting significantly lowered the barriers to entering the political process. This primary obstacle to minorities in running for office in an at-large system is the cost of campaigning and also competing with individuals who had long been part of the Anglo power structure in San Angelo. But by implementing a single district system, candidates campaigning in their community could campaign in their community for small amounts of funds, therefore allowing minority and working class candidates the ability to compete electorally. Furthermore, the single-member district encouraged candidates to be responsible to their districts and vote for their community's best interest. In turn, voters of marginalized districts actively sought candidates with whom they identified and trusted. So, after almost a year of the passage of the 1975 Voting Rights Act expansion, on April 3, 1976, voters of San Angelo turned out in large numbers to vote in favor of creating single-member districts. Winning by a margin of 1,300 residents voted to able to select their own single-member district councilperson, that would begin in spring of 1978. Cardenas and her allies worked hard to push for the approval of the single-member district plan, and later she would be recognized for her lead role in initiating the political project of single-member districts. And so Lee Kilgore was a writer for the newspaper in San Angelo, and she kind of followed Madea Cardenas' political life, and just focused on her. And so a lot of newspaper articles that I found was by Lee Kilgore and just followed her. And Lee Kilgore was one of the first women to be a political writer for the newspaper. And so I'm going to use this quote that she wrote for Cardenas. Quote, "As one of the chief spokespersons for the single-member district system and one of the main initiators of the system's petition, which forced city councilwomen to place the questions on the 1976 municipal election, she, as Madea Cardenas, calls the SMD system my baby and said that one of her major interests is seeing it work," unquote. So 2 years had passed since the election of the single-member districts, and the single-member district advisory committee had worked out technical issues and finalized district lines. And it was now time to consider viable candidates to present their community's best interest at City Hall. So on January 20th, 1978, Cardenas decided to put her name on the ballot for District 3, which represented the Rio Vista neighborhood, her community that she had long lived in. Her reasoning centered on the beliefs that residents in her community needed someone to represent them, who understood and sympathized with their needs. She's quoted for saying, "I feel that there are so many people who need a friend at City Hall," unquote. And at 43 years of age, with a decade of experience as an activist, Cardenas finally found the opportune time to run for office. So, in April 2nd, 1978, the newspaper says, headlines, "San Angelo's first single-member district election has gone into the history books." So the election of 1978 drew a higher than normal turnout, as some of 7,900 citizens casted their votes in favor of the candidate that they felt represented their community best. 4 of the 6 districts had clear winners, but 2 hotly contested districts with multiple candidates required runoffs. The need for runoffs surprised no one, but the candidates who made it to the runoff shocked many. In District 1, the southern part of San Angelo and Goodfellow Air Force Base, Mary Burke, who found herself running against Grady Sims, and across town, another first-time electoral candidate and, quote, mother, grandmother, and homemaker, unquote, Cardenas, faced Benny Nichols for District 3 seat. And so on May 13th, the results of the runoff emerged, and the newspaper announced, "Historic single-member district elects 2 women. Mary Burke and Cardenas both won their runoffs against their competitors, strongly continue to support for both candidates sealed the victory for them. Cardenas quickly developed some cooperating relationships with other commissioners and outside officials. Though while serving as city councilwoman, she found herself battling many issues with her Anglo-male colleagues, especially when it came to allocating monies for her district. Nevertheless, she helped with the Barrio street paving, support for the Fort Gancho Elementary School, and the riverfront project in the city. During election seasons, she made sure that the Rio Vista neighborhood had proper voting booths so that the community could vote. She was a fierce individual who would knock door to door if she needed to make sure the community was registered to vote so that they would use their political power in the city. Cardenas did eventually end up earning her GED and a bachelor's degree from San Angelo State University in the field of political science. She was a woman who raised 6 children and lived a modest life in San Angelo. Her prior political involvement shows that La Raza Unida helped elevate small but unprecedented numbers of Chicanos and Chicanos to successful campaigns in electoral politics, and their legacy continues today. So I want to end my paper with this quote from Cardenas when asked how she would like to be remembered. Quote, "It's abstract. It's showing them that they can be successful, that this is their government, that they can be heard, that they are not completely powerless, and I would like to think that that is my main contribution," unquote. And so as my paper has shown, Chicanas are historically important in electoral politics to make social and cultural change happen. Thank you.
Oh, that was great, Tiffany. Very inspiring. Really. All right, our final panelist today is Santiago Piñon, who's an assistant professor at Texas Christian University, and the title of his talk is Private Citizen, Public Woman, Religion and the Formation of Latina Leaders in North Texas.
Thank you. I too want to offer my thanks to Maggie for organizing this event. I'm honored to be part of it and to be here in front of all of you. Thank you very much for the invitation. That men have excluded women from the political life of the nation is a given. Yet women have always been an essential component of the American political process. One simply has to look at Martin Luther King Jr., who becomes a spokesperson of the Black Civil Rights Movement. And especially his speech, "I Have a Dream," which is known everywhere. Yet very few people would know or are aware that it was Prathia Hall, an African-American preacher, female, who used the metaphor of "I have a dream" prior to Martin Luther King Jr. To be sure, the same happened within the Mexican Civil Rights Movement when Cesar Chavez became the recognized leader rather than Dolores Huerta. Women, specifically Latinas, have always been the workers, yet scholars have rarely recognized them for their involvement. A quick perusal of our history books demonstrates the absence of Latinas. Latinas have always been at the forefront of various political movements and groups. For instance, in 1905, Lucy Parsons helped organize the industrial work of the world, commonly known as the Wobblies. People are often unaware that Miss Parsons' maiden name was Lucy Gonzalez, and she was African, Native, and Mexican origin. Many activist groups have Latinas as leaders. For example, Luisa Moreno, Josefina Fierro de Bright established and led the Congreso de Pueblo de Habla Español, which met in Los Angeles, California on December 4th, 1938, and gathered Latino workers of various backgrounds. Again, many of our textbooks are silent about these Latinas. One reason why Latinas are absent from the pantheon of recognized political leaders in the United States is that they are the victims of a political discourse dependent on excluding specific people. A common core value of American society is the inclusion of all individuals within the democratic process through consensus. Of course, this inclusion is characteristic of political liberalism, which focuses on the rights of individuals over and against the rights of the whole. One can juxtapose individual rights to the good of the whole. A stated goal of political liberalism is the inclusion of all individuals within the political community. Yet, political liberalism's inclusiveness is not all-inclusive. When one considers some of the prominent documentaries on Hispanics, notice two of them: Chicano, History of the American Civil Rights Movement, and Latino Americans, the most recent one, the 500-year legacy that shaped the nation, one will notice after careful reflection the conspicuous absence of women portrayed as leaders. With the exception of Dolores Huerta, women fill supportive roles for their male counterparts. The absence of female political leaders, even women who play significant leadership roles, is a reflection of the elusive notion of citizenship. Members of a democracy often uphold citizenship, an ideal in which all its members participate in the common good. This elusive ideal, however, excludes various individuals from the polis, the political life, yet creates a self-deceptive perception of full participation. I want to repeat that. This elusive ideal, however, excludes various individuals from the polis, yet creates a self-deceptive perception of full participation. It is impossible to maintain a comprehensive understanding of citizenship without having the notion of full participation in the political process of the polis. This paper will focus on a handful of women who have overcome the shadows of withdrawal and non-participation in the polis. These Latinas have risen above the shadows to become political leaders and become role models for the general public. My attention on these strong Latinos will focus on the role of religion as a system to lead public and successful lives. My methodology, as a graduate from the University of Chicago, method is always important. This paper will operate on two different levels. The first level will be theoretical in that I will analyze how political notions of citizens contribute to an individual exclusion from the polis and the common good. These two ideas of citizenship that I will focus on relate to civic republicanism and political liberalism, especially in their emphasis on citizenship status and citizenship agency, respectively. The focus of civic republicanism on status results in an identification of the citizen over and against the non-citizen. The importance of a citizen's identity is especially true in terms of patriotism. Philosophers and political scientists often focus on patriotism with its emphasis on love of country and symbols as an overwhelming characteristic that defines and makes a good citizen. Anything short of the patriotic ideal results in the classification of non-citizen. The second notion of citizen stems from popular political liberalism. Rather than focusing on the status of an individual as civic republican does, political liberalism views the citizen in terms of agency. A citizen can exercise her agency by participating in those activities reserved for full members of the polis. One of these activities in which a citizen participates is voting. In voting, a citizen uses her rights to cast political decisions that will affect other members of the polis. What distinguishes status from agency is that one can have the status of a citizen and yet be unable to exercise one's agency as a citizen. The 1866-67 Civil Rights Act, which gives native-born Americans the status of citizenship, but not the agency to vote, especially exemplifies the agency versus status distinction. Agency, then, is more restrictive, while status is broader. After analyzing the two notions of citizenship, the question remains, why are individuals such as Latinas excluded from the polis in contemporary times? For me, this is really amazing, right? So we Latinos have always been part of the history of this nation. From the very beginning, right? So you look at the treaty of the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty that gives Mexicans who are living, I'm part of those people, right? So my great-grandparents lived in Mexico, and then they woke up the next day, and then suddenly they're not in Mexico anymore. And they wake up and go, ay mierda, right? And so, right? That's what happened to them. Yet, the treaty specifically gives Mexicans legal citizenship. But they're not able to act as citizens. They do not have the rights as citizens. What I am distinguishing is the status of citizenship and the agency of citizenship. Many people fight over the status of citizenship, unaware that agency is what's really important, right? Because I can be a citizen and not have the ability to vote. being a citizen does me no good unless I have that agency. It would seem that one finds an inconsistency within the very political system that guarantees rights to all people, even the Civil Rights Act expansion that opened various opportunities for Latinos. Various obstacles arose that kept individuals from the polls in general, more specifically, kept them from the voting booths and thus agency. Take, for instance, the various voting restrictions passed by many states. While they claim to maintain the integrity of the voting booth, countless individuals who have the right to vote are being kept away from casting their ballots. In contemplating this situation, I propose that one finds the answer to the above question, exclusivity within political liberalism. That advocates identity, and this advocation of identity is the necessary counter-identity of the non-citizen. Therefore, even while arguing for an inclusive democratic society, political liberalism necessitates the exclusion of others. So just quickly, when one looks at civic liberalism, right, this idea of patriotism, love of country, etc., all of those are ideals that are set up over and against another ideal, which is the identification of the enemy. Right, so automatically you have us-them dichotomy. When one looks at political liberalism, right, political liberalism also has this notion of love of country, but it's a love of country for all people. It's inclusive, right? We want to make sure that these rights are for everyone. We seek to be inclusive of everyone. That ideal is set up over against the tyranny of authority and those who are in power. The big issue there is this issue of tyranny. Because within political liberalism, you still have the other. You still have the enemy. Right? Even though political liberalism, right, this is the prominent political structure that we now live in, it's claiming to be inclusive, sets up itself as being exclusive. You need the other. Right? No wonder when you go back to the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty and you look at legal cases like Indere Rodriguez, or you look up at the Hernandez case, there is always this otherness that's present, right? And the reason that you have the otherness, one should not be surprised, right? The reason you shouldn't be surprised is because you had Africans, blacks, who were other first. They get legal status, right? Right? They're no longer slaves. Now they become citizens. The only way that you can become a citizen is if you were either, well, two issues. One, you were either white or you were black. What do you do with a Mexican after the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty? He is neither, right? So again, you have the issue of status, but not agency, right? So what you do is, okay, we'll give you the status, but not the agency, and that continues. Well, I don't think I'm a skeptic, but yet when you look at history, it's the same damn thing over and over again, right? This idea of exclusion, and what is it that we're going to do about it? How is it that one does? As someone who's trained in ethics and theology, what has to be done is not just changing voting rights acts and the laws, it's also changing the entire political system. That's what's necessary. How does one do that? I don't know. That's where you get revolutions from, right? That's what takes place. All right. So the political place of women. With the above theoretical framework of looking at civic republicanism and political liberalism, I'm skipping a whole bunch of things. I now am able to turn to the second part of my methodological, which is praxeological. Praxeological just means practice, right? How does one put this theory into practice? The difficulty with this is, how do you put something into practice when you're working within the framework that is meant to exclude you? What you need is a theoretical framework that is meant to include certain people. And so what I do is I use three theorists, Hannah Arendt, which I won't bore you with all that, and also Iris Marion Young. Hannah Arendt, the reason that she's important is because she gives us a theoretical framework that being part of the political system means that one is able to act and to be. Right, and so that gives people, specifically Latinas here, this idea of that they are now able to act. You don't have to act in certain ways, but you're able to simply just act, and you're able to be who you are, which means that one now has freedom, right? In the old political structure, freedom doesn't necessarily mean anything unless you have agency. Freedom within what I'm trying to do, right? This framework, this theory, is it gives individuals freedom to do what? Freedom to do what they want to do, right? To be active, to be, simply just to be. Part of the problem is this thing that's known as a social imaginary. Social imaginary comes from Charles Taylor. This idea of social that things are not simply the way they are because that's how they are. Things are the way they are because that's how they were meant to be, right? You see this, right? I tell all my students, I'm at TCU, majority of my students are white, and I tell them in my classroom, the fact that you are mostly white in my classroom isn't accidental. Right? It's not. They freak out. Oh my God, he's crazy. I'm not crazy. Right? It's not accidental. The political structure, the laws, voting rights, policies, admission tests, everything was meant to make sure that you are here and other people are kept out. It's not accidental. It's aggressive. It's intentional, and that's the way it happens. So what do you do when you're trying to work within a system? How do you overcome that system when it's simply meant to keep you out? Well, you understand it. One way that you understand it is social imageries. Going back to women, right? The role of women, right? Women are in the shadows, women are in the back, women are the backbone, but these women are not in our textbooks. They're not in the front. They're not in the documentaries. They're not there. Why not? Because there's this social imaginary that women ought to be private, right? Not only are they private, they are not to be public. Because once she becomes public, she's no longer, right? Using Octavio Paz and these understandings of gender and how gender plays into it. Being a woman means a public woman. Being a public woman means that you are no longer doing what you're supposed to do, which means you are now a woman of the public, which means not good connotations to many people here, right? Which means what? That you're a woman of the night. You're a prostitute. The prostitutes, those are the ones who are in public. Right? And so therefore, any time that you have a woman who breaks free from this social imaginary, from this stereotype, is automatically portrayed or viewed or seen as this woman of the night, as this public woman. Now, we don't talk about them like that. We don't talk about you like that. How do men do it? How do we talk about you women as being public women? We keep you out of the textbooks. We keep you out of the history books. We keep you out of our political science books. We keep you out of our religious books. Oh, we'll include you. You're the support system. You're the backbone. If it wasn't for you, we weren't able to do this. Yet the social imaginary is still at play. Right? It's still, right? Jesus will talk about, give them the crumbs from the table. Right, that's what it's called. It's the crumbs of the table. We'll be happy with just mentioning this. So, what does one do? How does one overcome that? One way is, I think, as we saw in one of the previous videos, is this appeal to religion. Right, the religion. So let me justify me being probably the only non-historian, non-political science person in this room. Religion is powerful, and it's always there. People don't like to talk about it because it makes them uncomfortable. People think that religion is not influential, not there. But as we just saw in the video with John Trevino, it's there. Our people are religious. They use it. Now, are we talking about Catholicism? No. I'm talking about something broader, right? That it's not just Catholicism, not just Protestantism, but religion in the sense of that there's a state of being ultimately concerned, right? That we have this concern, and our concern may be a divine being, it may be a political movement, whatever. Whatever it is, it's religion in the sense that one needs faith in order to carry it out, right? So, I conducted some interviews, and these interviews I conducted from various Latinas. I'm only going to share the one with Latinas and divine. When asked how they perceive the divine or God, these Latinas gave a variety of surprising responses. Before I continue with this section, perhaps I should consider why the religious question is important. A brief example will suffice. 2, I won't give you that example. Some would argue that this question, see, I know how to listen. Some would argue that this question is relevant, the question of religion is relevant to understanding Latino political activism. I, however, would argue that ignoring religion is a result of a secularization that many people attempt when studying politics. Yet politics and the religious are often interrelated, if not the same. Moreover, when one views interviews like Ms. De Los Santos, which is through this Civil Rights Black and Brown, you can see that. You will see the statue of the Virgen de Guadalupe, one on her desk and one in her background, and the interviewer never asks a question about religion. Now, those may be ornaments, right? I have ornaments, I put them up. Right, I have Santa Muerte, I have them in my office. People are like, oh, what do you do with that? I'm like, I worship it, just to scare them. I still believe in the human sacrifices in your necks. I tell that to my students. They're like, oh. However, the fact that the question is kept out, is not asked, is telling about the secularization not only of contemporary times, but even of scholars, right? That we see religion not being important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Santiago. That was very good. And I know I was seeing you were skipping half of your paper, so perhaps we could have the whole version later. Yes. Okay, so we have some time for questions and comments. Yes, ma'am.
Religion is the default. The default structure is patriarchal. So, can you elaborate a little more on religion?
Yeah, what's really interesting when I interviewed these women, right? So these women are women who are engaged. These are women who are involved in mentoring other Latinas. They're involved in doing various things. What's amazing is that they all appeal to divine and to God as male, as father, right? To me, what that shows is that some of these Latinas are able to navigate around this patriarchal system. They're still within it because it means something to them, but at the same time, they're able to make the distinction between the institution that instills a patriarchy and the divine being that is separate and above the institution.
Interject a question there. What about the Virgin de Guadalupe? I mean, it's here you have kind of one of the most powerful symbols, religious symbols, and she's a woman. And so, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, men have used the Virgen de Guadalupe to control women. All right, I mean that's the given. The way that it's done is through this thing that religious people call Marianismo, right? The Virgin Mary, the Virgen de Guadalupe, right, is presented as this woman who's pure, who's submissive, who listens to God's calling. A woman needs to be pure, submissive, and listen to God. God meaning the head of the church. right? That, and then is placed, the framework is then brought into the family home. The woman needs to be submissive, she needs to be pure, and she needs to listen to the head of the house, right? That way. Women break out of that by appealing to different aspects, different parts. That's what I find fascinating, right? The fact that, yes, you have the Virgen Guadalupe, and yet they're able to manipulate around and away from these patriarchal systems. Right?
I'd just like to say that among younger women and older women, there's a whole movement of women that are looking for the goddess. And they're going back deeper into the cultures of most any culture on the planet. There is a goddess buried below.
Yeah.
And that's what we're discovering.
Yeah.
And I think that the younger women are going to be shifted.
Yeah.
quickly.
1996, Andrés Cisneros publishes a book that's titled "The Goddess of the Americas," and there she has an article on the Virgen of Guadalupe, the sex goddess, right? And so she goes beyond the Mexican symbol to these Aztec symbols, right? Right, and so she has a story of wanting to look under the robe of the Virgen de Guadalupe to see whether or not she has calzones. Right? Not that she wants. For her, is she wants to make sure that the Virgen de Guadalupe is a woman just like her, right? Because she's set up as this ideal, pure person, and she's like, I'm not that way, right?
And
so,
Maria Gambutas also, when she was one of the first archaeologists of women that went to work in many of the older cultures, the men, when they started digging out these figures, feminine figures, they call it erotic art. And Maria Gambutas corrected them and said, this is not erotic art, this is sacred art. So it's deeper, and it's just been buried under a lot of interpretation by the majority culture, the male culture, and so I think it's women having to redefine that for themselves.
Yes.
And I was just going to add too, I think that the emergence of knowledge about Tonantzin and our Nahuatl and Aztec heritage came with the movimiento, and that was an important term, whereas we start seeing this transformation and this sort of searching with women like Maria Elena and the woman from Raza Unida. That was a very pivotal moment where this sort of transformation and seeking of new kinds of spiritual or religious possibilities happened, and it is emerging and it is continuing because of this knowledge that they're passing down to future generations. So the spiritual and religious are very political, and I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area.
We'll put, Emilio.
So, real quickly, Jose Angel is next, actually. But, even before that, Las Hijas de Maria placed a great deal of emphasis on Las Tres Marias, Mary Bethany, Mary Magdalene, y la Madre de Dios. So, there's different sources that our community has been drawing a lot from that text as well.
Yes.
Just a couple of add-ons there. On black-brown relations, for example, there are certain code words that we listen to and we always think black, we don't think brown, we don't think about us. For example, lynching. But we have literature that tells us about it. And the same thing with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and citizenship. If you dig just a little deeper, as a test in 1848 to acquire that status, you had to pass a literacy test. You had to do this in English. 1848, 1977, Rosenberg, where he interviewed and showed it, But we never talk about the literacy test. And that was tried on us and implemented on us way before it ever happened in black. Adding on to your lore and your research, Dr. Samara, just an anecdote, in Kingsville, at A&I, 64, 65, and we have the faculty advisor who signed on, present in the room to validate this, if he cares to. We meaning the Chicanos at A&I in Kingsville, were basically commuters. We couldn't find housing and so on at that time, so we would always go home on weekends, out from Crystal City. All right, Crystal City had my political madrinas, who had the same problem for the longest time of being the backbone, as you put it, to Paso, but they couldn't join. They were women. And then young men couldn't join because we were not 21. So we had to work with the women, even though we were men. So I learned in Cristal, when we formed the Junior Paso chapter in Kingsville, we had to have a faculty advisor. He signed off, and talking to the women in Cristal, the women who were in Paso in Cristal in 1964, in the spring of 65, we went to the Paso Convention along with the chapter of ANI Paso, Junior Paso. We went to San Antonio, and the same repeat scenario of Ciudadanos Unidos. We both walked in and made the motion. The women made the motion with Hida Muskis to change the rules. He wasn't a member, but made the motion to change the rule in Paso to allow women full citizenship and membership in the organization, and young men, as he was pointing up to the Paso chapter for ANI, and it passed. Just Charlie Cottrell was a faculty advisor who signed off at that time.
I'm curious if y'all could point me in the direction of any research or study that's been done on the funding of the movements in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Texas in particular for Latino power. I mean, I currently work in philanthropy, and one of my core focus areas is building Latino power in the state of Texas. And when I think about how we're ever going to take over, right, from a statewide level, it's a huge undertaking. We're talking about massive voter registration drives. We're talking about massive community organizing. And you talk about Corpus, you talk about San Angelo, you talk about San Antonio, you talk about Austin, you talk about Dallas, we're talking about a huge scale. And so I'm wondering how that work was funded in the past, how it disintegrated, because to be frank, we talk about legacy projects now, we're not talking about the current one, right? So how it disintegrated so that I can think about what needs to be put in place to move forward.
Well, I think the obvious answer to your question is that there's modern funding sources, but before we had the modern funding sources like Ford and others. As you probably know, the funding was secured from the community directly through all kinds of funding activities. And the reason I want to say that is because George Sanchez himself said, we forget that when we raised money for the Hernandez case out of Taft, we were not only raising money from the people directly, but we were including the people so that they felt invested in the case against segregation and selection of juries. And he lamented the fact that we were too quick to go to Washington and so forth and so on. I would respond by saying we really had no choice. But I think we ought not to forget that when we raise money now, we need to integrate the community so that they're invested in what we do. Now, there's other people that can speak better to the funding sources, but I can tell you, when I was at A&I, we raised money on our own. We would get money from the university, small amounts. Things were cheaper then. But we were always scrounging for money to go from A&I to conferences to rallies in other parts of the state and the country. And it was, I think we were at that point of transition as far as funding is concerned, going from the old method of raising money through public campaigns, La Prensa, for example, led many of them, to now, depending on government entities as well as others. But others can respond to that.
Good night. Does anybody else care to comment on the
Jose?
funding?
Well, I think if there's a point, I don't know if it fits, but on the question, I think we also, those of us who were involved with a variety of programs on the war and poverty, we also took some of those funds and sort of cheated with them, right? If you want to call it that. And so that's why they wanted to dismantle them also a few years later, because they didn't like the advocacy built in. So that was another avenue, even though it wasn't direct funding for organizing.
You used it for organizing.
We definitely used it for organizing.
Anyone else wish to comment on the funding? No? Okay, is it on the funding?
No, I have a question.
Okay, hold on, because there's one more, and then we'll go to you. Yes.
I've worked enough campaigns to understand that a lot of the work, the nuts and bolts of campaigning is done by females. But not only Latinos, but also at the Anglo world, that kind of campaigning is also exactly the same. So how do you handle a deal with the Latina campaign issues without handling the overall issue where most of the grunt work is done by females and most of the highlight is taken by the males?
For me.
Anybody?
So your question was, how do you handle female campaign issues working with Anglos as well, or just Chicanas and Latinas?
The overall structure is the women do most of the grunt work. And I've seen it over and over again. It's not just Latinas, I mean, just overall. But having to resolve the issue of Latinas getting more visibility without resolving the larger question the society has.
So, as you mentioned, Latinas, Chicanas during this time period were active campaigning within La Raza Unida Party, but they also created their own organizations outside La Raza Unida, under the umbrella of La Raza Unida Party, like the Texas Women's Political Caucus, Mujeres por la Raza. And so they were campaigning, trying to create this, they tried to create this multi-ethnic relationship within that Women's Political Caucus, but it didn't, work out. But a lot of women within the political caucus, the Chicana caucus, within the Texas Women's Political Caucus, did help other Latinas with little monies for example, like Madea Cardenas, to campaign. And a lot of it, like Dr. Zamora has said, is community activism. A lot of these women went into their community and established festivals or created community engagement networks to create these funds. And like Cardenas's case, she had to create, multi-ethnic relationship with Anglo residents in lower economic communities. And so by that, my example is by that, they helped create more larger pool of funds to campaign and to run.
I'd like to add to that. I think the dismissal of women, the response to the dismissal of women is itself an explanation for the great participation of women in these movements. Now, I can't tell you, and I don't think anybody can, that we would have reached the same level of participation by women if there had not been any discrimination. But I do know that people were fired up by the very problems that they were confronting, and it was that actual and perceived problem that explains a lot of the participation. Now, regarding whites, that's another matter, but in other words, no way to measure the cause, but definitely the discrimination is an explanation for their participation. In other words, they're not only participating, but they're participating with deep conviction, which I think is very important. As the women feminists used to say in the 60s, that personal is political. They and their allies really believed that this was personal. They took it to heart. They were very convicted, and I think that contributes to the great significance of women in our social movement.
Very good. Yes, you had a question.
I wanted to touch base with you about the religious aspect that you're having in your presentation. And one of the issues I have is like with the state of Texas with the HB2 bill that passed. And, I'm one of those where we have men making women's decisions, and that annoys me. But coming from a low-income background where you have women who are taking advantage and using the resources of an organization like Planned Parenthood, but then they're also Catholic, and they're being told that you're not supposed to stand with abortions, and then the whole media outlet aspect of abortions being tied to Planned Parenthood, so then that gets defunded. So that's the part that I keep getting confused on. I know women who are actually using Planned Parenthood for their healthcare services, but then, when it comes to the religious background of how they were raised, where they're not supposed to be. So, separation of church and state, but how does that, it's involving a lot of the political policies that are getting in place and talked in Texas. So can you talk about how we can, I don't know.
No. Religion is weird, right? I mean, it's used to justify certain things, but at the same time, it's used to not justify certain things. For instance, I think Christianity has this idea of inclusiveness and kindness and love of enemy, love of others, and I don't want to pick on anyone. There are certain people within the political structure that use certain aspects of religion, but not those, right? They're like, oh yeah, we'll be inclusive as long as you think like us, right? Which historically, that makes entirely sense. You go to Augustine, you go to Donatus, right? This idea of impurity. What do you do with those people who are doing things that they're not supposed to do? Well, you get rid of them, right? They you don't let them in the church, or you pass policies, you pass ecclesial laws to do with that. Right? So I don't know, right?
You touch on all those focal points in your presentation, so it's one of those things that it starts getting my wheels turning again about that whole.
It's easier to talk about problems than solutions.
Yeah. But it's good that it's being talked about, for sure.
So all three of you raised some real interesting ideas about where these women are getting their, as you say, agency. I think that they're asserting their agency, but have you considered this idea of embodied knowledge? You know, Gloria Anzaldúa talks about this conocimiento that people have, especially Mexicanos, Latinos, of this lived oppression. So out of lived oppression comes this knowledge and this conocimiento and this, you know, this embodied knowledge, and it helps. It has helped, you know, with engaging in public action, because then she ties it to public action. So I see a lot of that conocimiento, and I'm not sure maybe you've ever thought that.
Well, you know, I'm accustomed to hearing about the strong association between women and spirituality. And I tend to believe that they're more explicitly spiritual than men. And I'm attached to a woman who thinks spiritually, to the point of saying not only that we embody all that we've gone through, but that we also receive ancestral knowledge. Sometimes, you know, the way the mind works is that, you know, you never know that sometimes subconsciously you're connecting some words that your father or mother gave you regarding some difficulties that the family or individuals faced, and somehow the brain connects it with something else. And that's my rational explanation for that kind of ancestral knowledge. But I give great respect. I listen to that a lot, primarily because I believe that women perhaps may be more serious about the three Marys, about things like you know, imagined things that are connected to real things and so forth. I believe they're more spiritual, or at least they're explicitly more spiritual. They talk it more. So I listen to that. I never asked the women that we interviewed what kind of spirituality was behind their decisions to be. But Dr. Brenda Sandejo did in a subsequent study with some of the same people that we interviewed, including Maria Elena, especially Maria Elena, who is a very important spiritual leader in our community. And I mean that with great respect, spiritual leader. We use that word kind of loosely. But we do need people to make sense of things that you can't explain rationally. It's not just a matter of explaining things rationally. And that's what I think she brings to the table as a woman with great experience. She was the head of the Raza Unida Party in 1974, and she self-describes herself proudly as a spiritual person and the president. But anyway, Brenda could speak more to that than I could.
This isn't a tribute, but it actually gives me an opportunity. I wanted to actually acknowledge and thank Dr. Zamora and also Dr. Rodriguez, because I participated in that graduate program, that class, and it was actually, it inspired my dissertation, because I got to meet Maria Elena, and I got to participate in the World War II project and learn about the importance of being connected to people's stories. But I saw Maria Elena's spiritual and political trajectories intersect. So it's material. The transformation and the going to Donazi is embedded in the material circumstances of life, of severe sexism, of trauma, of abuse, the realities, right? And then the resistance is about the healing and also the empowerment. And like Dr. Zamora mentioned earlier, they're doing things today, where all of you are doing things today that are very important. the work of healing the community, healing the bodies and spirits is very much needed.
Yes.
Yes, I'd like to go back to the funding part that was discussed just a little while ago in regards to voting and whatever. I think that one of the things that really fascinates me, that astonishes me and everything else, is the fact that we hardly ever talk about economics in the process of everything that we do. I think that this is an incredible vacuum that we have in our community. When you look at the fact that we make, say, in Texas, 40% of the population base. If you look at, I'd like for you to visually look at a pie, cut a chunk of it, 40% of it, and then take a look at another pie and cut with a knife one just little slit through that pie, representing about 1/4 of 1% of the total assets in the state that we own. That is mind-boggling, and I know that most of the people, it is to me, and I've been dealing with it for about 45 years. It's such a dark area in our community where, for example, the University of Texas has never graduated a PhD in economics in its history. A Mexican-American PhD in economics in the history of the University of Texas. That's an example. And if you remember what, I just say it in the simplest way possible, when Bill Clinton was running, he says, the economy's stupid. And so we don't have the resources, and if you get into the economics of what's really happening in our community, it is incredible, because we are now competing in our community with so much money coming in from Mexico, from Asia, from China, from the companies here. We have no access to capital. We have literally no access to capital so that we can get our efforts going. Take Austin, for example. 6% of the population is black now. Mexican Americans live on the fringes of Austin. We have no access to businesses in Austin. So I think that in your dialogue, in your academic discussions, at some point, you better start addressing the issue of economics, because we'll be talking, I know I ran for office in 1966 with no money. And yes, it was the women that put me there. But I was running against millionaires. We're doing the same thing here in Austin right now. We have 3 Chicanos, and they're all wonderful people, have no clue about what economics is. If you read the paper, and I'm not going to expound anymore, because I usually talk too much about this, but if you looked at yesterday's paper, you'll see something very significant in that paper. The state of Texas gave Circuit of the Americas, a foreign-owned company, $250 million to have little cars running around the racetrack. That's a stipend of $25 million a year that they get. City of Austin, for example, on one venture, which they do 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 ventures like this, they gave a domain $100 million. This Hispanic quality of life went to them and asked for $7,000, and they said, we don't have any money. They just now approved $200,000, the city of Austin did, to Pakistan. They couldn't give the Chicanos here in Austin $7,000, but they give in Pakistan $200,000. Folks, you need to change your perspective in order for us to survive and to effectively participate in the political process, because it's all money. I'm sorry it took so long, but that to me is the biggest vacuum that we have in our community right now. Every community in this country has a public policy research center addressing these issues. We have none in our whole country. In 1974, I started, just one more point and then I'll shut up. In 1974, I started the Mexican American Economic Research Center. In this country in 1984, there were only 4 Mexican American PhD in economics in the country. Think about it.
Gentlemen.
To
get back to the spirituality and religion and things, it struck me that each one of the presentations deals a little bit with an area that there isn't really much work done on, and that is the deep emotional and psychological structures that govern our behavior and our perceptions and our definitions of reality. And my work is in racism, and part of racism, definition of racism, has to do with fear. And I'm learning more and more that it's a really deep subconscious structure that governs that. And religion is one of the deepest and most embedded, I guess, emotional and psychological structures that we have, and it carries all these sanctions with it. And I really would like to see more and more work in that particular area, because those sanctions drive your behavior. Your fear of saying things and expressing things and doing things and participating a certain way is what inhibits you from doing a lot of different things. Fear of the advancement of women, or fear of women, would drive the patriarchal structure to impose all kinds of different sanctions, the anti-abortion movement, and things of this nature, for instance. And so, I don't know where that came from. I just started writing that note this morning, but I mean, that's for me.
That's divine intervention.
Okay, we have two last comments or questions.
See, in terms of what you're talking about, Santiago, in regards to agency, I look at studying and looking and examining the United States as sociopathological. We don't need any more economists. Economists are calling the U.S. economic system, the whole study of economics, is completely balderdash and needs to completely be revamped and looked at it from the perspective of sociopathology. Christopher Lasch in True and Only Heaven, Progress and Its Critics, which is a very religious study, looks at how the history of the United States has developed this lack of respect for the other and no sense of fair play. C.L.R. James in The Black Jacket writes about it in his monumental work in 1938. The colonial system is set up sociopathologically. We have politicians that are sociopaths, if not psychopaths. And do we really want to get into that system and mold ourselves into becoming sociopaths and psychopaths? I don't.
Thank you. One final comment. We've already run over time.
A quick question. I'm interested in knowing.
Excuse me, can we hear you? We can't
Yeah,
hear
I'll
the
shout louder.
And these microphones pick up all the sound in here. So
perhaps you could put stuff back.
I just would like to know where you would put the level now for Latinas in this whole dynamic of their equality in the community. Have they broken the ceiling? I see a lot getting elected, but I realize there's ground to be made up, but have they really gotten rid of the barriers when you talk to the women that you talk to? And then second, I'd like to know, do the Latinas that you speak to or that you have been speaking to, and the Latinas in the room, do they relate to Hillary Clinton as a woman, as a white woman, and the white feminist movement, and see an application for them, or is there a divide there? And just so everyone knows, I'm a reporter, and if any of you would like to talk to me so I can get your quote on that afterward, I would love to have it.
Well, I think you can have a lot of very interesting conversations if anyone wants to address the question briefly, because we've run over time.
Well, I'm not going to respond directly to you, but I think one of the things we need to do is frame all that we say and project out of our community, politically speaking, that is, that we're not only seeking material gains, as has been indicated already. One of the reasons we call our movement a movement for social, for equal rights and dignity is because there's two sides of it. We're seeking material gains or of that, things of that sort. We're also trying to create a new cultural person. That's what we were saying back in the 70s. Che Guevara said it very clearly. We need, in other words, we need to instill the values that are necessary for us to survive with some kind of sanity. It's a two-pronged attack. And spirituality is part of both, obviously.
Yeah. And human dignity allows you a voice to say yes and to say no to a lot of things.
I think a lot of enabling women and empowering women into political office today in the present day, I think it differs regionally. As we saw currently with Washington, Dr. Gutierrez's daughter was just nominated. But in Texas, we still have, historically, we have Chicana Latinas women serving in electoral positions like Madea Cardenas, like Irma Rangel, and many war women. So I think it just differs regionally and the political leanings of each region throughout the state. But I think it's important to look, it's important for the numbers of women in the nation and the state, but it's important to also look what they're doing to empower other women to make sure that their representation is there.
All right, well, thank you very much. One more.